Welcome everyone to the May 18th, 2020 meeting of the Library Advisory Commission. I'm Bob White, Chair of the Library Advisory Commission. I'm now calling the May 18th meeting of the Library Advisory Commission to order. Clerk Samano Vargas, please read the roll call.
Lindsay Bass.
Present.
Bruce Cotter.
Present.
Rena Dubin.
Present.
Jim Landreth.
Present.
Mary Ritma.
Present.
Tricia Wynn.
Present.
And Bob White.
Present. Thank you. The first item is to adopt this evening's agenda. We need a motion on that to adopt the agenda. Do we have a motion?
I move to, go ahead, Bruce.
I move we adopt the agenda.
And I'll second it.
Thank you. We have a second.
Tricia.
The clerk will read the roll for a roll call vote.
Lindsay Bass.
Yes.
Bruce Cotter.
Aye.
Rena Dubin. Did you say anything, Rena?
I did. I said aye.
Oh.
Yes.
Jim Landreth.
Aye.
Mary Ritma.
Aye.
Tricia Wynn.
Aye.
And Bob White.
Aye. Motion passes and the agenda is adopted. Next on the agenda is oral communications. And any member of the audience and the public may address the board on any matter either on or off the agenda that is within the board's jurisdiction. If you intend to address a subject that is on the agenda, please hold your comments regarding that item until it is before the board, so that we may properly address all comments on that subject at the same time. Moderator Jones, do we have any general public comments or communications at this time?
We do not have any public comments submitted at this time, Chair White.
Okay, hearing none, thank you. Our next agenda item is report by the library director, Susan Nimitz, and the report is for April 2020.
And I've submitted 2 reports, one on the facilities projects and one on the general goings on of the library itself. Rather than go through them in great detail, I just would like to highlight some changes. The Aptos project is in the process of selecting a design build entity. There are 3 firms that are being interviewed, and there's a design team doing 3 3-hour interviews of each firm. The interviews are complete and the design team really needs to come together and make a recommendation. Our expectation is that the selection will be approved this summer with contracts. Community design process will occur in the fall, and construction will begin in the fall of 2021 with the branch opening at the end of 2022. The Boulder Creek project, bids came in, all the bids exceeded the available funding. The project's going to be rebid this summer. Construction should begin in the autumn. It will delay the Boulder Creek branch opening probably till late spring 2021. Capitola's moving forward. The difficulty over power lines has been overcome, and we're hoping for a fall 2020 opening. The downtown branch has gone for its 5th architectural assessment. Group 4 did a presentation last week looking at spending $27 million in a mixed-use project. And the subcommittee should make a recommendation this summer to the full city council. Dalton's up and running until COVID-19. La Selva Beach is under construction. Construction's been going a little bit more slowly than we anticipated. All of our projects were deemed essential, meaning they could continue during the shelter in place. But the contractor had some difficulty getting subcontractors to show up on site. So we're slightly behind. We expect the grand opening really early 2021, like early January 2021. Just in terms of the JPA report, I've about operations is I've just included a lot of the things that we're doing during the COVID crisis. The facilities have been closed. We've done a lot of virtual programming. I'm so proud of the staff's ability to sort of rotate their energies, pivot what they were doing, and come up with some really exciting digital programs. We had 4 programs called Shelter in Faith with community faith leaders and elected officials facilitating conversations about how people are managing this really difficult time. We just did a book group last night on sort of the economics of crises with Supervisor Coonerty. I know that the first shelter in place had over 90 people attend. It's been pretty exciting. We've been working really closely with K-12, in particular, as teachers had to really completely pivot their curriculum. We're doing a concierge service, helping teachers find digital resources to support their suddenly online curriculum. And we're promoting a lot of our digital services like BrainFuse, which is online tutoring. We've worked with vendors like Ancestry.com, which had traditionally only allowed us to offer that service within the library walls, and now anybody with a Santa Cruz Public Library card can use it in their home. We're trying to work with some of our special populations. We've done consistent work in the jails. We were no longer able to visit, so we allowed them to have sort of a standing collection within each of the jails we've been working with. We gave out some digital devices to shelters serving people experiencing homelessness. And so staff have been working hard. Later, we're going to hear from Eric Howard, the Deputy Director, about our plans for reopening and sort of our work plan for next year. So there'll be more information. Are there any questions? Then let's keep moving.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Thank you for your report. The next item on the agenda are members' reports. Are there any reports from your respective regions? Please identify yourself if you do have any reports to make. Are there any reports? All right. I was going to report on Capitola, but Susan's done a very good job on that, so I won't be making a report.
Bob, it might be a nice time to introduce our new members because I know that they haven't met each other and we have almost a new board.
We do. We have 4 new members. We're excited about that. And the 4 new members are Rena Dubin from the city of Santa Cruz, Mary Ripma from the city of Santa Cruz, Tricia Wynn from Supervisors District 2, and Bruce Cotter from Supervisors District 5. And then the 3, so welcome. We're so glad you're with us. And I think it's going to be a really exciting and challenging year. The 3 continuing members from last year are Jim Landreth from Scotts Valley, City of Scotts Valley, Lindsay Bass from Supervisors District 1, and myself from the City of Capitola. So again, welcome. We're so glad you're with us. And
What an odd way to meet.
it is different. We'll be very glad when we can get back together and we can actually sit across the table from one another. I think that will be something to look forward to. Since there are no members' reports, additional members' reports. The next item on the agenda is the consent calendar. And it's the one item on the consent calendar are the minutes from the February 24th, 2020 meeting, the Library Advisory Commission.
And members who were not there are eligible to vote on this. We need a quorum to approve them. So
I would move for approval.
Jim, thank you.
I second that motion.
Bruce, thank you.
Great. I needed to ask the public, is there a public request that this agenda item be pulled from the consent agenda and be placed for separate discussion following general business? Moderator Jones?
Chair White, at this time, we do have a pending question. I'm not sure which item it's on, so we will need to hold for just a moment.
Okay, thank you.
May I ask a procedural question in the meantime?
Yes.
I'm just curious about us voting yes to approve minutes when we weren't at the meeting.
Susan, do you want to address that?
It is technically allowed for minutes
Okay.
of the meeting. And Sarah, has the
I
question
would
come
note that
through
I
yet?
was present at that meeting.
Okay.
So I think we're waiting for Moderator Jones to get back to us on that.
I am still waiting to hear which item the person would like to speak on. It is coming in through our telephone information line, which is one way that the members of the public can post comments. And so there's a little bit of a lag time. So because they are free to call in on their landlines, then a member of the library staff can transcribe that comment. So I'm just trying to make sure that it's timely submitted.
And Sarah, I'm able to see it. There was a question about the director's report. They want to know why I'm talking about a 27 million project cost for the downtown library when the number's been reduced to 25.5 and the money put into Garfield Park and Branson 40 building projects. My instructions by the City Council were to plan for a $27 million library, and their instructions to Group 4, who did the analysis, was to do an analysis for a $27 million library. And I think if they have questions, they could ask the City Council.
That's the end of the comment,
Okay,
Chair White.
all right. So there's no general comment about moving the consent item to the general business?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we have what, a motion on the floor and a second? Is that?
That is correct. Jim moved and Cotter seconded.
Okay, fine. So Clerk Samano Vargas, please read the roll for the roll call vote.
Lindsay Bass,
Aye.
Bruce Cotter,
Aye.
Rena Dubin. For some reason, I can't hear you, but okay.
You're muted.
Abstain? Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes, we can.
abstain. Okay. Jim Landreth,
Aye.
Mary Ritma,
Aye.
Tricia Wynn,
Aye.
and Bob White.
Aye. Motion passes and the minutes are approved. We're on to general business, which is agenda item number 7 on the agenda. And the first item under general business is the fiscal year 2020-21 work plan and opening plan, which is on pages 11 through 16 in the agenda packet. And Library Director Nimitz will.
I would like Eric Howard to do this presentation. Sarah, can you unmute Eric?
I am. Please stand by. Go ahead, Eric.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Good evening, commissioners. It's wonderful to see you and welcome to the new commissioners. We are definitely looking forward to the day when we can have you back in our libraries and we're doing this all in person. I just wanted to start by saying we started working on next fiscal year's work plan prior to this health crisis. And so what we're trying to represent to you here are highlighted in yellow are either additions or changes that we need to now address because of this new world that we are in. But what's interesting is when we've reflected on what we had put together prior to this crisis, everything pretty much remains the same. And in fact, it's something that we are either already doing or we are changing it some to meet these new needs. So I'm just going to start with the first element in there that is highlighted. We are putting all of our energy into how we can bring back some of the traditional services that we had been providing before the health crisis. So today actually marks the first day that we kicked off Curbside service. We started with 3 libraries, 3 locations, Aptos, Downtown, and Scotts Valley. And it may not be Curbside and kind of now what we've all traditionally in the last 7 weeks or 9 weeks started thinking about what Curbside is. But what we are attempting to do is address those patrons who have been waiting for the past 9 weeks for the items that were sitting on the shelf, and we told them they are available for you. And then we had to shut the doors down right away. So we're clearing off the shelves approximately 1,700 items that we're waiting for those patrons, and there's approximately 1,300 unique patrons who will be coming in, we believe, over the next couple of weeks to pick up those items. After that, and I'm going to go into details about how this is going to work in a little bit, we'll start responding to those new requests that are still coming in because you can still request an item. And we will expand the service to Live Oak in June and Felton in June as well. So right now, if you put a request in, you'll see that you have 3 options, and your item will be sent to either Downtown, Scotts Valley, or Aptos. And then beginning in June, those options will expand to Live Oak and Felton. So there was, because we're essentially and have been reshaping our organization, we've been making a lot of changes. We are working through all the guidelines that we have from our county health services and the CDC to ensure that our workers are safe, that the materials are safe, and that we're handling them safely, and then sending them back out into the community and being mindful of all those guidelines. So we have essentially broken our plans for reopening, which is just one piece of the work plan, into 3 phases. We've just kicked off this first one today, as I mentioned. The next phase doesn't have a date to it. We're looking at criteria rather than a date, similar to how the governor is determining what his phases of opening the state will be. He ties it to criteria, and we'll be doing something very similar to that in terms of when we have the public come back into the libraries. And when we do that, it won't look like it did back in the beginning of March. It'll be limiting the number of patrons who can come in, and it'll also limit some of the things that they can do. So I just wanted to touch on that quickly to give you an understanding that we now recognize that a lot of our energy is going to go into figuring out what our buildings are going to look like, what kind of precautions we have to take, and how we're going to staff our staff so that they are always 6 feet apart from one another, and following the other guidelines that we have. Everything else is going to evolve with this crisis, but it is still an objective. In fact, we are, for learning, we are doing actually quite a bit of community-based programming now, virtually. We are still running a high school online, and we are still working very hard with life literacy. Susan mentioned some of the great things that we're doing for K-12 support. The digital inclusion has now taken an even more of a priority for us, so that we can bring more people into this virtual world, where the library is actively engaging our patrons more and more on this platform. The transformative spaces, we will continue working on the building projects, as Susan mentioned too, so that doesn't change. And the user experience piece is also something that we are going to be focusing in on this year as well. And then that brings us down to number 6 on the work plan, and it's the last highlight on there. The board approved this. We decided that because of so much uncertainty right now, and because we are spending so much time on figuring out how to reopen these buildings, that we asked to postpone development of the strategic plan and the technology plan for the next fiscal year, and they approved that change. So those are some of the big pieces that I wanted to call your attention to regarding our next fiscal year's work plan. And then I wanted to just highlight some of the pieces that I just referred to around how we intend to open up and what that means for our patrons. The top here goes over some of the current activities that we are engaged with right now, which is pretty extensive. And if you have time, I highly encourage you to take a look at the virtual library. We are developing out new programs, some really good things that are coming up. We had a very successful Shelter and Faith program. It was a 4-part series. It was very well attended, just as well attended as some of our large programs that we have in our large public spaces. So for instance, in some of those programs, we knew that we had over it was about 80 unique participants. And then we know that for people who are viewing from home, they're often viewing with partners or family members. So we know that it exceeded over 100 participants that were in just one of those 4 programs. And that was the average. It was around approximately 80 people, unique visitors to those programs. So we're doing quite a lot right now. We're going to continue that, continue to learn from it, continue to build on it. And then the next piece here is, as I mentioned, actually opening the buildings and getting the items into people's hands. I should also mention that our ebooks are up 80% since we had to close our doors in March. And we have shifted some of our budget to help support that, because as you know, ebooks are not cheap. And so we have shifted some of our budget around to support these new needs. But we will also now be getting print materials into people's hands to the end of this month. And then beginning in June, we really will be ramping up that service. And Susan and I are on weekly calls, both with the city directors and also with the county, And in those county meetings, we often hear from Dr. Newell, our county health officer, who's giving the direction and the updates on what we need to know in order to keep our staff and our community safe. And so we're incorporating that information as we go. And one of those things that we changed, that actually has changed since we even drafted this, is we recognize that there is a safe way that we can handle returns right now. That was one of our biggest concerns. I mean, aside from how we can safely operate and keep a safe number of people inside our buildings and perform this function. And so the CDC guidelines and the World Health Organization both point to the necessity for materials to be safe, to quarantine them for 72 hours. And so through our operations, we're doing a longer period of time than that, just to err on the side of caution. And so obviously the items that we moved off the shelves into the customer's hands this week and next have been sitting far longer than 72 hours. They've been sitting for now almost 9 weeks. And then items that will be returned, we have a special way of handling them, putting a sticker on them essentially so that we know when they came in, and holding them for more than 72 hours before they go back into circulation. And there was a lot of problem solving around that, so that we're keeping our customers safe, and our staff who were taking in those returns. Right now, those returns, we're providing it between the hours of 1 and 5 when we have the curbside. And the reason why we really pushed to try to manage that was because knowing our patrons, many of them, even if we said we're not taking your returns right now, they would still put it into the hands of our staff. And so we wanted to prevent that, and we wanted to have a safe way so they could come up and deposit those items. So we're not loudly advertising that we're taking returns, and we're still very forgiving, so that people don't have to worry about fines. But that will continue to evolve, and then I think in June we'll be ramping that up as well. So that's kind of one correction to what's on this document. And phase 1 has a couple of stages in it as well, so that you can see us ramping up those locations. And then phase 2, which we don't have a date to, as I mentioned, because we're going to be looking at criteria and guidance from the health officer of the county. So we won't open up all buildings in this phase, or at least in the first stage. And so we've basically been going through this mode of testing this, see how it's going, see what we can learn, see how we can continue to do this safely. I was out there today at downtown watching. There were 5 people who were kind of in the queue waiting before we opened at 1. And anytime you're starting something new, it doesn't always go 100% smoothly as you planned. But the patrons seemed to, for the most part, be very understanding around what we were trying to do with the social distancing, because we want to ensure too that they have masks on before they communicate through the plexiglass with our staff. We want to make sure that they're safe and that they are distancing themselves. And so it did go fairly smoothly. We have them calling on their cell phones so that they can get in the queue right away, and their items are waiting for them when they come up to this plexiglass. It's kind of like the old-fashioned banks when you, similar to that. And so the books are pushed underneath the plexiglass, and they're there for the patrons. It did go fairly smoothly, but I think we still have a couple of things that we have to tweak, and we'll get there. And then after those 5 people went, there was a lull, and so I think it's being managed really quite well at this stage. But we look forward to doing a lot more business in June with this. So I'm going to stop there because I just threw a lot of information at you, and I'll just mention that Phase 3 is when we really anticipate that world that we're all very eager for, when things really begin to return to normalcy, which likely would be when we have a vaccine, and then we can have safely the same number of people we used to have back in our libraries. And again, we obviously don't have a date attached to that. So that's
Eric?
3 phases.
Eric, could you explain why we're not doing curbside at B40 in Garfield Park?
So it's for Garfield, it's there's first we wanted to start off slow. So we don't anticipate getting though to a point where we're going to be doing curbside at Garfield and Branson 40. And Garfield is really too small of a space to have the staff inside it that we need in order to operate something like curbside. And Branson 40 has some challenges as well regarding the space for how the public would queue up for it. Additionally, too, we're in a stage where we're still trying to sort out staffing. We did have to, unfortunately, suspend the schedules for 63 of our part-time staff. So we are down also quite significantly for the number of staff that we have as well.
Okay. Thank
And
you.
then I just want to say that probably the biggest complaint I've gotten through the shelter in place is that we aren't doing curbside drop-off. There's a whole group of people in our community that really rely on print material. It is their approach to reading, and they felt they really needed it during this time. This has been incredibly complicated, and I just really want to honor the staff that worked on it, in particularly with the unions. You know, the staff are really nervous to come back. You can imagine we all are nervous to go out there, and we just really need to button down our policies and procedures in a way that the union felt comfortable that the staff and the patrons were going to be safe. One of the things that I really admire about Eric's approach, and I think it's working well in terms of the staff, is we're really just taking baby steps forward with the goal of just keep moving forward. So we're starting small and expanding, learning, redoing, taking another step, and sort of repeating that process. But I very much did underestimate sort of the emotional response of the staff in terms of their fears in coming back to work, and how long it would take to work with the union to make sure that they felt that their safety was covered. And I suspect that will be an issue into our future as we take each major step in this, just assuring that safety at a time when our our national messages and our statewide messages and our local messages often contradict one another. It's just been very difficult.
And I thanks, Susan. I just wanted to add too, because we're often relying when people are in that queue to call on their cell phone so that we can have the items waiting for them. And we have also offered to mail items to people. So one thing I left off of this is that all week we have called every single, we're in the process of calling all 1,300 of those customers. And we've taken it as an opportunity to not only inform them that their item is waiting for them and ready, but also to check in on them, see how they're doing, and also inform them of all of the virtual programs that we're offering if they're interested. We don't just go into a spiel on that and beat their ear in about everything that we're doing, but we ask them if they're interested in learning more about what the library is doing. So there's a whole team that does that and reaches out to those patrons. And that's really been met with a very positive response.
So the question I have for the commissioners are, what are you hearing on the street about the library? Are you hearing anything?
And then Susan, I think we also may have a question from Lindsay. Lindsay, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I just had a clarifying question on the comment around staffing. You mentioned having to suspend schedules for 63 part-time staff. Were those regular or temporary staff, or a mix of those two?
It was 63. It was temporary staff.
And I would say the library relies heavily on temporary staff. It's unbenefited positions, and it's going to have a significant impact on our ability to do our work. But in this environment, we felt we could not ask permanent staff to take reductions until we stopped using the temporary staff.
Thank you. And I just want to say, just maybe to kick things off, thank you guys for all of your incredible work. It is such a challenging time. I feel like everybody is just, trying to grapple with this unparalleled uncertainty in their own lives. And you guys are helping us find outlets and places of refuge and ways to come together that are new and unknown to us. So just thanks for, pivoting and, to the resilience of your staff and team. I just really wanted to applaud all the hard work that you all have been doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would second that, and I think the new website is really fantastic. I don't know that I've heard much on the street about, I'm not really on the street very much.
Yes, and that's the truth.
But my own personal experience is that the reference that I was able to get was helpful. Everything's very well done.
Thank you.
Great. Are there any other comments from the commission?
Yeah, I would like to comment.
Okay, Rena,
And Tricia.
Tricia.
I just want to thank you very much for being able to offer the curbside service. I think it makes a huge difference for a lot of the people, especially with families and young children.
Thank you, Rena.
Thanks.
Okay, Tricia.
You're on mute, Tricia.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to thank the staff too. And I think this is a really nice measured approach to start with the holds that people have been waiting for. So I have been talking to people. I had an opportunity to call for the Friends, a number of people who had made donations for that virtual campaign that they did. And, every single person that I spoke to they had changed. They like reading books, but they were now listening to books, and they were taking advantage of some of the programs, and they were reading ebooks. And, it was kind of nice to see the resiliency of the community. They had a lot of questions about when does the library open, but there was just a real, appreciation for how hard the staff is working to kind of bridge the community through this tough time. So, and I'm reading, I'm listening to books now, and I'm a reader. So, old dog, new tricks.
Thank you, Tricia.
Wonderful to hear. Thank you.
And I would just second what Tricia said. I made several calls for that Friends campaign, thanking people. And the feedback was extremely positive. I mean, people miss the library. They miss being able to go down there, but they understand what you all are working through. I don't think they understand as much as we do now what you all are working through, but they are understanding and grateful for everything that's been made available online.
And I just want to
Commend you guys for the efforts.
I want to acknowledge the Friends raised over $16,000 to put towards our ebook collection. And they did it so quickly. I was just amazed, which really helped us because our waiting lists were getting really long.
Thank you very much for those comments.
Are there any additional comments or questions?
This is Lindsay. I have a couple of additional comments. The other thing that I wanted to mention, you guys, the fiscal year 21 work plan is pretty impressive, like how well that aligned to the situation that you find yourselves in now. So good job on reading, what you couldn't possibly have known, but that, COVID was coming your way. There's a lot of pieces in here, and even the transformative spaces, the ability of those projects to help fuel the local construction economy is also going to be really important, I think, as we move forward. I had a question on number 1, the reopening and continued restructuring, kind of the phases that you guys are going through. Are those meant to align with the current stage 2 of Governor Newsom's reopening plan? So is that your breaking up of phase 2, or is it just kind of like phase 2 into his stage 3 and 4? Is it just kind of looking out onto the horizon? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I can maybe Susan, you want to answer this as well. We've been looking at his. I mean, we follow his guidance, obviously, and but phase 1 doesn't line up with phase 1 with his phase 1 and his phase 2 with our phase 2, because we have 3 phases. He has 4, and then we are trying to do different elements to it. I mean, we are looking to follow his criteria, and we're plugging his criteria into our thinking on how we're going to get to phase 2.
And I would say we may want to redo our phases to match that, because I think people have a better understanding of that now. If you look at our current operations, it does sort of line up with their phase 1.
Okay.
I think they're close.
Just from a community standpoint, helping folks understand where you guys are versus kind of where the state and the county are, I think will be helpful just from a communication standpoint.
Great feedback. Anything else?
Okay, any other questions?
I did have a question.
Okay, Rena?
I'm just curious if people who are really eager for the print books, if they should be putting them on hold, or if that's going to overload your system even more.
Nope, we can handle it. Go ahead and put those requests in. You know, I'd encourage you to see in the catalog if there is an ebook, and try that out. And as you've heard tonight, you can certainly call our staff 7 days a week, and they'll walk you through that. That'll be the fastest way, most likely, for you to get access to the item. But for if you want the print book, or if it's only available in print, go ahead and put that request in.
And then I just want to point out that libraries as physical facilities aren't built for social distancing, and that many of the things that we are trying to achieve and do, particularly around our community gathering places and community learning centers and community-led programming, don't work well in this environment. So the thing I just need to be really frank with people about is it may be a long while until we are operating in the environment we were operating in 4 months ago. And I just think about summer reading with all these amazing events that brought children and families together to learn together. It has to look really different than the way it looked the prior summer. What we don't want to do is lose our audience. And so we're asking our audience to stay with us, give us feedback, but we all may have to do things a little differently. You know, another major role we play is as the meeting room place for community groups to come together. And just in the short run, we can't play that role. And I would say the one that breaks my heart most is the digital literacy piece, where we provide the PCs and printing for a huge section of the low-income people in our community. And, you know, we're racking our brains. We're trying to bring devices to shelters. You know, I know there are libraries that are talking about removing chairs and separating computers, but it's still really difficult because those are very high-touch activities. And so this is not going to be an easy journey. I'm so thrilled we've taken this first step. But as you look at the phases, I just have to say that the ending phases are farther out than maybe we're acknowledging.
Okay. Any further comment from the commission?
Do you mind if I comment again?
Go ahead, Rena.
Go ahead,
That's why
Rena.
you're here.
I do know how important the print is for a lot of students, just being able to use a printer for free. So, but I do acknowledge how impossible some of the restrictions are going to be. So, you know, just to speak to the importance of the library and also just acknowledging, I know how hard it really is. And if there's any creative ideas we can come up with to facilitate some of that, it would be really helpful.
Eric, while we're thinking out loud, we do allow wireless printing.
Yeah.
So you can theoretically print from home. And I wonder if we could put that in our curbside pickup service.
I think it's worth exploring for sure. And we've been talking about that, about how we can provide digital resources, the hardware outside the walls more and more. Because as Susan said, we are providing it to some areas, shelters is one, and to continue to explore that, I think is something we absolutely need to do. And then one thing I was going to add too, just kind of along this whole spectrum, we just introduced an app so that once in that phase that's right around the corner, hopefully, when we can have a limited number of people into the libraries, they can use the app on their phone to check out the print items, so they don't have to really interact too much with the staff, and they don't have to touch the self-checkouts. They can just use their phone to check out the books. So we're trying to get there, yeah, slowly but surely.
Great idea, Rena.
Great. So I think we're going to move on to public comment. Moderator Jones, do we have any public comments or communications regarding this agenda item?
There are no public comments at this time, Chair White.
Thank you. Going to come back to the commission. Any further discussion or deliberation on this? And I'm going to ask Library Director Nimitz and Assistant Director Howard, what action would you like the commission to take on this or to consider?
I think it would be helpful to have a motion to endorse our strategy for reopening and to come back at each of the future LAC meetings to report our progress.
All right, do a motion then to endorse this.
I move approval of that recommendation.
Is there a second?
Bruce, second.
Okay, we have a second. We'll do a roll call vote. Clerk Samano Vargas, please read the roll for a roll call vote.
Lindsay Bass,
Aye.
Bruce Cotter,
Aye.
Rena Dubin,
Aye.
Jim Landreth,
Aye.
Mary Ritma,
Aye.
Trisha Wynn,
Aye.
and Bob White.
Aye. Okay, motion passes. It's unanimous. Thank you. We're off. Let's see. We're on to the next agenda item, which is item B under general business. It's the fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021 Santa Cruz Public Library budgets. It's pages 17 through 22 in the agenda packet. And Susan, would you like to walk us through that?
So ordinarily, the LAC meets in April and May, and the JPA in May and June to present, propose, and approve the following fiscal year budget. We run our budgets July 1st through June 30th. So our new fiscal year starts in July. About 50% of our budget revenue comes from sales tax. And as you can imagine, Sales tax, the other 50% is primarily through property tax. And during the COVID crisis, the property tax is relatively stable, but the sales tax, as you can imagine, has just bottomed out. You know, if you look at the tourist economy, that is Santa Cruz's economy, we're not getting the hotel TOT tax, we're not getting retail tax, we're not getting the restaurant taxes. We're really suffering. So we have not only a deficit projected to finish this year, but also a deficit projected for next year. I have to say that a private organization that the county works with does the projections, and most of our decision makers believe that these projections are optimistic. To begin with, they're suggesting that we will have a 1.2 million deficit for the remainder of this fiscal year, and that we are likely to have at least a 3.8 million reduction in revenue in the following year. So what we recommended, because we had to solve the FY 2020, this current year's budget, we instituted a hiring freeze. We stopped using the services of the 63, sorry, I thought it was 62, on-call or temporary staff pool. We've reduced deferred spending where feasible. So like we stopped our cleaning contractors and some of our security because the buildings were empty. And we estimate that we'll still have to save or spend about $1 million from our balances. I have to say that I'm very proud that our board has been super conservative and have ensured that the library has some really decent balances. Right now we have about 2.8 million in our budgeted reserve. And why am I blinking? It's up here in this report. Oh, 2.9 million in our budget reserved and 1.8 million in basically fund balance. And so that gives us almost $5 million of one-time funds to help us manage, you know, they call them rainy day funds. Well, it is raining. They did approve that approach to solving the 2020 problem. And we talked about our approach going in for 2021 and reducing the budget by 3.8 million. Part of what I wanted to get from the JPA is the extent to which they view this as a temporary crisis or a long-term crisis. Because if the financial changes are long-term, we really need to modify the way in which we are operating. The extent to which it's a temporary crisis, we may be able to manage it using some of these one-time funds. The other thing is, what does temporary mean? Does temporary mean 8 months? Does it mean a year? Does it mean 2 years? I think in the discussion that I heard from them is that they probably believe that the next 2 fiscal years will be greatly affected by COVID-19. And I think everyone's hoping that that 3rd year out, things will improve. And so I made some suggestions to them, like continuing the hiring freeze, not using any temporary employees next year, reducing current personnel expenditures by, I'm proposing 800,000, which is about, sorry, my daughter's calling from Washington. And she won't stop. I can't get her off. Maura, I'm in a board meeting. Reducing personnel expenditures, really, we have our contract set. So we have to negotiate with the union or else we do layoffs. And then we're going to have to reduce public service hours. And we have to look at what makes an hour is not an hour is not an hour is not an hour. Part of what we have to look at is the union contracts and how they work. We have two people always have to be in the building clause. There are requirements for breaks and lunches. There are requirements for length of shifts. And so all of that can greatly affect the schedule of a particular branch. So we really have to look at that. I want to time the opening and closures of branches due to construction to maximize the staff use. We'll talk about that in a minute. I think we're going to have to cut the materials budget. And this is a little tragic because we need opening day collections for these branches. I have to say we spent $150,000 plus on the opening day collection for Felton, and we have Capitola opening soon. And then I'm asking that we use about $1.5 million of the reserve, which would still leave us over $1.5 million in reserve at the end of fiscal year 21. But I think that some of these financial consequences will extend into 22. And so I do want to have some reserve at the end of that. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you, ask you is whether you have concerns about any of these strategies. And then I wanted to show you a little bit of a chart and make a recommendation to you that I'd like to bring to the JPA with your endorsement. So do you have any questions about what I've said?
Questions for Susan?
Susan?
I don't have,
Oh, go ahead.
I don't have a question. I just have a comment about the materials, which it seems like that would be an easier fundraising perhaps than some of the other things. I think people like to know that they're contributing to materials. So that's something that it's sad, but I think maybe we can make up that budget.
Thank you. We have about $1 million budget for material.
Is
and it
this
is supplemented every year.
prioritized, Susan?
Pardon me?
Is this list of potential cuts prioritized, or do you anticipate just doing all of them?
I anticipate doing all of them.
Okay.
We've started the negotiations with the unions about pay cuts. The departmental directors have all agreed to a 10% pay cut. I think the unions are trying to negotiate furloughs. And then there are some unions that are really struggling with cuts and really want to look at layoffs. We've already lost 63 staff people, and although they're part-time, we have about 98 remaining. And I think we have 8 positions right now that are unfilled that we'll lose with the hiring freeze. I also think the city is going to offer potentially some retirement incentives. But I also think retirement incentives are difficult right now because of the uncertain economics for people facing retirement.
Susan, am I reading this right on document page 22 that you're looking at, if we look at the sales and use tax revenue, you're looking at only about $1 million reduction from the estimate for the current fiscal year?
Correct.
So that's about a 13% reduction. That seems, like you said, overly optimistic.
And
we're going back to restaurants with 2/3 capacity even.
And the reduction is 18% or 19% next year, starting July. But I agree, Jim. I think this might be an optimistic sales tax, which is also why I don't want to completely spend the reserve, because if the cuts go deeper, it might rain for longer than we know.
Well, I mean, 13% is not much of a cut. I know it's more, a bigger one from what you have budgeted, but do you have a Plan B budget that's more pessimistic?
So what the JPA committee members suggested, that we actually probably budget quarterly, that we come back in September and review the budget. And then I think it would be December and March, so that we could make cuts that are necessary.
And I appreciate that your budget has to rely on their guidance.
But it's going to be a rough year. If it's okay, Sarah, I'm going to try to share a screen. Could you enable my ability to do that?
Can't at this time, Susan.
I can't? Am I allowed to, ever?
We just have to make those arrangements ahead of time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, then let me talk through something that I'm looking at. So one of the ways to spread the pain really is to look at our opening and closures of libraries. We're having a lot of openings and closures over the next 2 years because of the building projects. One of the things I have sat down with the commissioner or the JPA board members and said, are you committed to 10 libraries no matter what? And each and every one of them said yes. Ordinarily, when you're facing this size of cuts, one of the things you would look at is reducing the number of branches.
Sure.
They tried to do that in 2012. It was decided that they will never try to close branches again. And so I just need to say that one of the basic assumptions of our budget discussion is that we will have 10 branches. Anyone want to comment on that?
Comments from the commission?
I think that's a fair assumption that people will be pretty upset if you try to cut the branches.
What do you think is the minimum number of hours a branch would be open?
Well, so we're working on that. So 3 years ago, what we did is the JPA approved branch hours every year as part of the annual budget process. And we put the branches into sort of 3 tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3, with the small branches with limited space and lower circulation being tier 1, mid-sized branches with full services being tier 2, and basically the downtown branch was tier 3, being a large branch with full services and specialized services, like the fact that it warehouses most of the collection, and it has specialized services around things like genealogical programs and collections and local history. We also agreed 3 years ago that as we look at hours, we don't have enough money to provide retail hours at each and every branch. And so what we want to do is make sure that sort of those expected retail hours are covered within a region. So we want weekday, morning, afternoon, and evening hours, as well as weekends, both Saturday and Sunday, covered within a region, but not necessarily within a branch. And if you look at the hours that our branches currently have, we have all of those things covered regionally, but not at a branch. So the idea is, could we leverage project closures to enhance hours and get us through this tough time? And so we believe that if we follow the phased opening plan that you just endorsed, we do not believe that public service hours will take place until the end of phase 3 or the beginning of phase 4 of the state of California's recovery plan. Okay? And when I say normal hours, meaning the branch is open 8 to 5 and people can just come in. So we believe that we are going to be on an altered public service hour plan until phase 4. And so let's start with July 1st, 2020, finishing out this year. We believe we'll have the curbside delivery at the 5 branches we identified by July 1st, and that we will have plans in place for beginning to open the buildings to limited access. But we don't need to have any hours necessarily approved before July 1st, 2020. We're just going to still be in COVID hours. We believe that between July and December, we're going to be stepping up, but we may not reach phase 4. Right now, Boulder Creek, Capitola, and La Selva Beach are going to be closed. We're suggesting that potentially, now this hasn't gone out anywhere, including the JPA, and it's a strategy that I'm just posing towards you, and you can tear apart. But I'm suggesting we close B40 and Garfield Park. They were supposed to go under construction in December or January. And if we're going to only partially open them to partial services, I'm wondering if we could just keep them closed. So it'd be an early closure of B40 and Garfield Park. That the remaining libraries, Aptos, Downtown, Felton, Live Oak, and Scotts Valley, from July to December, we would maximize the hours we could in each of those branches based upon our recovery phase and our staffing available. And then in the spring, we would close Aptos early. This is controversial. They're not scheduled to close probably until September of 2021. We're suggesting probably closing Aptos in January of 2021 at the time we open Capitola, so that we could use the staff from Aptos to staff Capitola for the period, the 18 months that Aptos is closed. And then Boulder Creek would still be closed as planned. Garfield Park and B40 would be closed as planned. And we would open La Selva Beach and Capitola after January 1st of 2020. So what this does is basically extends the amount branches are closed due to construction. And I would say it affects every single branch except for Live Oak and Scotts Valley, because they're primarily done and will remain open. And I think in the future, when the downtown branch closes, regardless of which approach they take, some of the downtown branch staff could be used to staff into fiscal 2022. What I'm also asking is that instead of having the JPA approve the hours for 2020, which are going to be so dependent the phase of recovery we're in, that the JPA empowers me to make the decisions based upon the principles we set forward. Just one caveat, I think what we need to do is work aggressively to create policies and procedures to allow the public to use the building after hours for community meetings. We have an example of San Jose, who leaves the buildings in the hands of preferred community partners. And so the building's used for longer hours of the day, but there are times when it's not staffed by library staff. What is your reaction to that?
Any questions from the commission?
I'd just like to support the idea that you're the one to make the decision. Along with, you know, advisors. But I think it's clever the way you're, you know, managing the closures with the staff moving. Yeah.
Tricia.
Tricia?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Susan. Wow, I can't believe this group of library lovers, 4 of which are coming onto the commission for our very first meeting, you know, and really just, you know, having to face, you know, decisions like this. It's pretty daunting. Susan, I admire your, you know, rational approach to that. It's heartbreaking, you know, that we're faced, and yet here we are. I think you know, as I said, I think it's a rational approach. I think, you know, there are going to be a lot of people very unhappy, but if there are other libraries available, in other words, when you close Aptos, if La Selva and Capitola are both vibrant libraries, you know, we're just going to have to get over ourselves. So I do appreciate that you know, you've got some fallback plans for all of these, and I do think we can you know, make a more vibrant library system when this is over, you know, this economic hardship. So you know, I am willing to support your recommendation.
So any other comments?
Yeah.
Bruce?
I think you're making the right call here, Susan. I think that the messaging around this is going to be critical. That these are temporary closures, not permanent closures, and that when we talk about closing a branch like Aptos, here are your alternatives. Here's the extended hours that'll be available at those alternative locations that would not be available if we tried to keep all of the branches open. The whole messaging is really key to getting this thing to go across without upsetting the community. And I support you. I think you're making the right call.
I think Rena was next, and then Lindsay.
I'm a little wary of this plan. I think the Bransford and Garfield Park, I think, makes a lot of sense to me. Aptos closing early, you're talking about closing it early in the winter of next year. And I think that that's maybe when a lot of people will be expecting for things to return to as normal. And people love that Aptos branch. And I think you're going to get a tremendous amount of pushback from the community. I've witnessed a lot of the people when they were talking about closing branches, and I just think it could end up being a mistake to rely on that. Maybe an option might be to delay the opening of La Selva Beach. That might be an easier sell to delay an opening than to make a closing happen early. So hope that makes sense.
Rena, I completely agree with you that I think that Aptos is almost the most difficult and will require a lot of communication. And one of my hopes was if people are open to this, and I'm calling it a strategy because the devil's in the details. What I would love to try to do is get the Aptos project moved up and moving faster. And as I look at the timeline, I think we because I'm asking for a 9 months closure right now, beyond the construction. If we could like move it up by 5 months, I believe it might be more politically palatable for the residents. But I agree. I think that that one's a really tough one.
Okay. Lindsay?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with, I think that it's a smart strategic approach. I think the devil is always in the details, which we're hearing a little bit about what those details that might be challenging would be. I think that's the friends groups are going to be really essential to helping to communicate this to the different populations. But, you know, this is a time where the community is experiencing a huge impact. We're all going to have to sacrifice. And I just think that there is a need for folks to acknowledge it's going to take time for us to come out of this. And this is a way to preserve, you know, some really robust services in strategic locations rather than trying to spread you all so thin that it makes it really, really challenging for you to manage all of these COVID dynamics at so many different locations. So, yeah, I would, and I have to say, I'm also going to agree with Jim on the need for maybe some additional scenarios regarding the budget and revenue projections. And that may also, you know, help give you more justification for this approach.
And I apologize, but we may need to, if we're going to have that many budget discussions, we may need to add some LAC meetings. I don't think we'd go more than once a month, but I think we currently schedule 8 a year, and we may have to go monthly, at least for the next year.
I think that's a good idea.
I have a question that's coming out of a lot of not knowing really how you manage the bookmobile. But when you have closures like that, do you use it to supplement?
We've had a really full schedule with the bookmobile. It's really focused on geographically isolated people. So we've done a lot of nursing home and sort of the Davenport, and we go to some of the farming communities and the migrant workers in sort of the rural part of Southern County. We also have done some, primarily the daycares that have lower income folks. We did backfill La Selva when it closed because Selva Beach is actually pretty geographically isolated. But we haven't done, we haven't done Boulder Creek. And it was a capacity issue. Do you give up some of your regular nursing homes to backfill a branch that's closed? You know, what's nearby? But I think we're open to having discussions. Eric, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
I think you hit the kind of the important points. I mean, right now, it's not operating, obviously, because of the COVID situation, and it's something that we're exploring. We're talking to some of those partners to see if we can't, just like we're mailing items, to see if we can't just deliver items over to some of those communities. So, and it's hard to know, of course, where we'll be in 6 months with the health crisis as well.
But Mary, I like your point of we have a beautiful bookmobile. We actually have a really amazing staff on the bookmobile. I think it is a tool in our set of tools that we may have to think differently about.
Any comments before we move on to public comments? We're going to come back to this as far as further deliberation. So, Moderator Jones, do we have any public comments or communications regarding this agenda item?
We do, Chair White. The first one is budget shows $4,640 for room rentals into 2021. I thought the library was discontinuing charging for meeting rooms. Shouldn't this number be 0?
So in March, we had a set of proposals that we were going to bring forward towards this budget, one of which was to eliminate fines for late fees for adults as well. We decided to pull our whole agenda in the short run and just really focus on the coronavirus. My long-term goal would be to stop charging for meeting rooms. What our goal would be to do is really focus meeting rooms on nonprofit learning activities and not necessarily seek those revenue sources. So right now it's in the budget. It will, you could argue either way. My hope is to bring those policies back later this year.
The next public comment is, if you close B40 and Garfield Park and downtown is going to be renovated, will there be a library open in the city of Santa Cruz?
And we would never close all three at the same time. If we remodel the existing facility, just to do the construction documents and permitting, I'm sure will take 18 months. And so by then, our hope is that Garfield Park and Branciforte would be open. If we go to a multi-use facility, it's probably 2.5 years before we would have to realign the staff.
Are there any further questions from the public?
Chair White, there are no further public comments at this time.
Thank you.
So actually the motion that I would like is a motion to approve the budget strategy and to allow the library director to set hours through the duration of the COVID-19 process in fiscal year 2021.
And this is something you'd bring back.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bob.
I heard two things. One was perhaps coming back with a more conservative scenario as far as the budget. I think something that the JPA has also asked for. And then secondly, the plan to temporarily close and then open the individual branches. So I think there are two issues there. And so do you want two separate motions on this, or do you think you can combine this in one motion?
I'll bring the second set of scenarios to you in July regardless. I just think that's a requirement. What I need to say is that this group endorsed the concept of not setting hours for 2021 and to allow us to be more fluid and allow hours to be set based upon staffing and opening and closing of libraries due to construction to maximize services.
All right. So am I hearing that you, at this point, you do not want a motion to support the budget as presented, or are you asking that we endorse that plus the plan as far as staffing?
I think if you just endorse the budget strategy as outlined in this meeting,
Okay.
to me that includes both.
Okay. So do we have a motion to endorse the budget as presented this evening?
Yeah, I'll make a motion to endorse the budget strategy as outlined in this meeting and to provide Susan the right and the authority to make the decisions regarding staffing to make that budget work.
Is there a second?
I can second that.
All right. So we have a motion and a second. We'll now proceed for a roll call vote. Clerk,
Chair White, I believe Lindsay wanted to speak again.
Oh, I'm sorry. Lindsay, go ahead.
Can we just add to the motion that included within that approval that the director will be bringing back adjusted scenarios at the July meeting?
That's fine.
All right. So Clerk Samano Vargas, please read the roll call for a roll call vote.
Lindsay Bass,
Aye.
Bruce Cotter,
Aye.
Rena Dubin,
Aye.
Jim Landreth,
Aye.
Mary Ritma,
Aye.
Trisha Wynn,
Aye.
and Bob White.
Aye. Motion passes unanimously. So that brings us to adjournment. We are adjourned until the next regular meeting of the Library Advisory Commission to be held on Monday, July 20th, 2020 at 6:30 via Zoom teleconference. Thank you everyone for joining the Library Advisory Commission meeting this evening, and good night.
Thank you, Bob.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Well done.